We have been talking about what, I guess for lack of a better explanation, I'm calling contemplative faith. I left my notes on the printer this morning, so I'm not going to remember my exact words, but we were talking about contemplative faith being something about being fully present to God. So being present in heart, mind, body, soul to God, opening ourselves to God's love. And so a lot of times contemplative faith has to do with things like prayer, lots of deep prayer, listening, an experience of God rather than just intellectual knowledge of God. So how do we get this into our hearts, into our bones, where we're living out this kind of stuff rather than just thinking about it, which is where it starts, but hopefully not where it ends. And so the first 2 weeks we talked quite a bit about forgiveness, the idea of being people of forgiveness, but also that not only do we need to forgive others for specific things they do, but that's connected to this more universal forgiving the world for being a fallen place, just accepting that this world is what it is, and it's not all good, but we don't have to fight and resist the fact that it is what it is, forgiving the universe for being the kind of place that hurts us. And so this week I want to move a little beyond that, although I think it is related, but more to some ideas about this kind of letting go in general. So I think forgiveness is one form of letting go, but kind of broadening that to a more full sense of letting go. And then also to our sense of identity and how this connects to our sense of identity. So since I don't have my notes, every time I hit forward on a slide, it's going to be a surprise to me too, and I'll have to try to remember what we're going to do today. So one of the things I wanted to talk about, there's this idea in Matthew 6, which is right in the middle of the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus has several sections where he says, don't do this in front of others. So it starts with Matthew 6:1, be careful not to practice your righteousness in front of others to be seen by them. And then he goes on to say, don't fast in a way that people notice, don't pray, on the street corner for people to see. So I want to start with just kind of reflecting on that. Like, why do you think Jesus had to say this? Why do you think that we seem often so fixated on wanting or needing to be seen by others?
So that we won't appear to be holier than thou to someone else.
So that's why Jesus said it. So our temptation is that we do sometimes want to feel holier than thou.
Well, also at that time, the Pharisees were famous for it. He was trying to, how many times did he say, woe unto you Pharisees? He was trying to discourage that.
Yeah.
I'm concerned about the word righteous. I heard someone define it once as simply being in a right relationship with God. I'm a sinner, condemned, unclean. I don't deserve His grace or His salvation, but He extends it to me anyway if I come to Him. That's the right relationship with God. But in secular society, the word righteous means, you think you're so holy. We're almost afraid to use the word righteousness in front of our secular community because we know what they think when they hear the word righteous. It simply means being in a right relationship with God. And that means acknowledging that I'm not perfect, that I'm not holier than thou. And it's the opposite of what society seems to do.
Well, maybe that's what he was trying to prevent. I feel like you might be righteous, but practicing in front of others might be a temptation for you to start to feel self-righteous, and it turns into self-righteousness. Then it turns into, well, why do you have to do it in front of other people? You're still righteous in the closet at home by yourself. It doesn't need to be practiced in front of others, or else you might be tempted to become self-righteous and for a show.
Yeah.
Or, others might construe it as self-righteousness.
That's good.
The image of, I don't know whether it's from a TV show or a movie, but where a person's at like a diner and comes up to pay their bill and is going to put their tip in the tip jar, and they're about to put it in, and the person behind the counter turns around.
Looks away.
And then, so they hold it, and then they turn back around, they put it in, and then they turn back around, and they're trying to make it. I think we're caught up with trying to make sure we show people we're one of the good ones.
Mm-hmm.
We're not one of them. I'm one of us.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't want to be put in that category. And
Right.
if they don't see us do the thing that makes us an us, then I might be considered a them.
Yeah.
Or,
Yeah. I heard a quote once that said, "I want to be humble, but what if no one notices?" Yeah.
The righteousness God defines is God's righteousness.
Yeah.
The righteousness that had to be revealed through the gospel message. So, and the lack of understanding that is why people go on to establish their own righteousness. And in this time, it was a lot easier to do because everybody looked up to the Pharisees as the most holy, the most righteous, the example of faith, the example of everything.
Yeah.
And so the gospel had to reveal being righteous is being right in the sight of God. So you have to be flawless. You have to be holy and blameless. And it's nothing we can do to be blameless. We're already blameless. So it kind of, if you think about God's righteousness, it keeps you focused on your own unrighteousness,
Yeah.
The actual unrighteousness, but it also that faith produces a righteous life, not just looking at each thing you do, just looking at your direction in life.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good. I also want to think a little bit today about sort of where we get our sense of value from. And so I know sometimes when I think about other people's assessment of me, how they see me, it hurts most when I think it gets to my value, whether I'm worthwhile, whether I'm good, because to some extent my sense of my own value is tied up in how other people value me. Right? And so this is kind of a trivial example, maybe. It's not a huge deal, but I work essentially as a consultant, and my clients are like companies, and I had a chance to win a project with a company, and it was a guy that I've worked with before at 2 other companies. So I knew this guy really well. Within my industry, this is probably a little bit of arrogance, but I've always felt like my team is like one of the more strategic ones, like we're doing the more sophisticated stuff, and this was a guy that I thought wanted to do some really strategic things. And in the end, we didn't win the project. And he basically said, yeah, I thought you and your competitor could both do it, and I let my team pick, and they felt like the other people just brought kind of an older, more experienced team. And I got to tell you, having worked with this guy twice before, thinking I knew him, thinking I knew what he wanted, feeling like we were the strategic option, the fact that we didn't win that was kind of a kick in the gut. Like, oh, I lost to them? Like, they're not that good. What do you mean I lost to them? And so, again, we're not really focused as much on forgiveness today, but in a sense, that idea of like forgiving the world for being the kind of place it is, like I have to let go of the fact that doesn't define who I am, right? Like whether I am doing the best I can at the work God has given me or not, whether somebody else reacts to it in a certain way is not what defines that. Somebody else's reaction to what I'm doing isn't what defines whether I value to God, right? Or whether, and so where is it that we're getting kind of that identity, that value from? So let's play slide roulette and see what I got next. All right, so I've quoted Kevin Sweeney a couple of times in this class. He writes some interesting stuff on contemplation. So this was one of the things I found that he said, recognizing my ego and all of the ways that my separate self attempted to get its needs met outside of God, swung open the doors in my heart to welcome and take in the love and presence of God. So I think what he's saying is, it was only after sort of becoming aware of the ways that he was trying to get his needs met with things other than God, that he could then open himself to really just getting those needs met through God, right? It's the love, the presence of God that should be where we're grounded. But until we kind of go through the process of seeing that we try, right? What are all the other things that we try to hang our identity on? The love and admiration of other people, or status, or success.
Jason?
Yeah.
I think about the scripture that say, what we do in secret will be rewarded openly.
Yeah.
Not to be seeking of people, but it's coming from the heart. And That's how God used certain people.
Yeah.
Because they're not taking credit and boasting up for the work that he laid on your heart to do. But we are doing his will consistently, and then eventually, a little by little, a person will say, well, she never exposes herself, but I know that she's one of God's children.
Yeah. Throughout Matthew 6, he has several examples of that. You know, what's done for the praise of men, that is its full reward, but what's done in secret, God rewards in other ways.
Jason, that
Yeah.
comment there about needs outside of God reminds me of a friend of mine who, I think I've told this, well, everything I've said in this class I've told before, but anyway, my wife tells me I'm an old geezer, I tend to do that a lot. But he was suffering from an addiction, and he was part of a recovery group. And he said, as he was reflecting in his group, he said that I'm a person of faith. I know God is what gives me direction. He said, I know I have to toil through life. And he made the metaphor of rowing a boat. And he said, you know, our job is to row that boat. God's back there steering. He gives us all the direction. And he said, I started thinking along the lines that I'm not stupid. I know how to direct myself. I'm just as good at giving myself direction as God. And so he depended more on his own guidance, and of course that's what led him into this addiction. And he said, I was in the back steering my boat, metaphorically, and I was proud of what I was doing, but he said, it came to me that I wasn't going anyplace. And he said, that's when it dawned on me, God don't row. And he said I had to acknowledge the fact that God will give me all the direction I need and all the encouragement I need, but God don't row. You know, that's our job. Genesis tells us our job is to toil through life. And but anyway, just remember, God don't row.
Yeah, that's interesting. I don't think I remember you telling that particular story before. It's good.
We were old geezers too.
Yeah, I may very well have just forgotten. So this is back to like my idea of my friend at work not hiring me for the third opportunity with him. You know, am I defining my worth in the appreciation of others? And one more quote from Kevin Sweeney. He says, the problem is not that some people are never going to show you the appreciation you deserve. The problem is that you haven't let go of the need to be appreciated by others. The problem is not that things didn't go the way you planned. The problem is that you cannot let go of the way you thought things were supposed to be, and thus remain unable to embrace where things are. So that idea of letting go, I think we talked a little bit last week of the idea of like non-attachment to outcomes. It's not that some outcomes aren't better than others. It's not that God doesn't call us to seek justice and to serve and to work, you know, but there are many things beyond our control. And if our value, our worth, our sense of God's love and acceptance of us is tied to a particular outcome, and then that outcome doesn't happen, we lose that sense of God's love, that sense of our worth. We are to work for the good, right? We are to seek justice, we are to pursue righteousness, but our value can't be defined by certain outcomes because none of them are fully in our control, right? We have to accept where we are.
I just wanted to touch base on you going back and forth because your friend didn't hire you. It's probably that he didn't hire you because you wasn't good at your work, but he didn't want it to, he may have thought he didn't want it to be favoritism.
I appreciate that interpretation. Yeah. I'm going to rely on that. That's good. Okay, so this next section I think is really interesting. I debated whether to try to go through all of this or not, but I think it'll be worth it. And so what I want to look at is this idea of in order to truly live, we have to die first. So what does it mean to die in order to live? And so a couple of verses where Jesus Jesus and then Paul, I guess, where Jesus talks about it directly in Matthew 10:39, and then there's an almost identical verse later in Matthew 16. Jesus is talking and he says, whoever finds their life will lose it, and whoever loses their life for my sake will find it. And in Galatians 2:20, Paul, reflecting on that, says, I have been crucified with Christ, and I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. The life I now live in the body, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me, and gave himself for me. So I think if we grew up in the church or been in the church a while, we're probably used to hearing things like this. But what do you think it really means? I mean, especially this first one in Matthew, where this is even before his crucifixion, and he's telling his followers, whoever loses their life for my sake will find it. What does that really mean?
Isn't that the metaphor of baptism? I mean, baptism is a public manifestation of our willingness to die to the old life metaphorically, and to literally and metaphorically be buried with Jesus in baptism, so that God can metaphorically resurrect us as a new person. I mean, I see that in what you said.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I love that image of baptism, being buried in the water and raised. Yeah.
A lot of times when we think of the word life, we don't think of livelihood, but they did. You know, the thing that kept them away was their riches. They said, well, first let me do this, let me take care of all this stuff. And even the rich young ruler say, well, what must I do that I inherit eternal life? He say, sell all that stuff that's in the way. You know, they don't want to give up their life, and your livelihood is more than just your money. It's your value, your worth, your power, your authority. All of that was in the way of a lot of the people then, because that was what was viewed as, hey, they got to know God if he blessed them like this. And that, a little that's going on now. If you understand what it meant then, you can kind of look around now and see hadn't much changed.
Yeah, that's really good. When Jesus calls the apostles, some of them literally drop their fishing nets in the middle of the day and follow him. And then there's a series of stories where Jesus calls other disciples and they give excuses, right? So he tries to call someone and they say, yeah, I want to follow you, but let me go do this first. Yes, I'll follow you, but let me go take care of this. And I think it's this Matthew 10:39 verse that comes at the end of a series of things like that. And Christ basically says, like, if you're not willing to forsake all of this stuff for me, you're not worthy of me. Reflecting on all the reasons that people didn't follow him.
Well, you can make that sacrifice practically daily in the small little things of life.
Yeah.
And I think it comes up more when someone is going through something where you really cannot finally control the outcome. Like when someone is in the hospital, or you find like there's some life thing happening and you really have to, you're forced to let go of the reins. And some people will just clench and clench until, so stubborn, not wanting to let go. And some people will be like, I'm going to do the right thing anyway, and doing the right thing being whatever it is that puts you in harmony with the peace of God, and you just let it be. And I think it feels like, in those times, you're unattaching yourself to the outcome, right? Like the outcome is what it's going to be, and you're still loving God despite that, or you're still finding value in yourself through God's love, despite what's going to actually happen or what could happen. And then basically he's saying you're going to find life even through that. And I mean, that's like an extreme example, but I mean, it could be just apologizing or just accepting someone, or just, all the small things that we battle with on a daily basis spiritually.
Yeah.
Paul said, I was reading this week in Ephesians 4:30, he said, and do not bring sorrow to God's Holy Spirit by the way you live. Remember, he has identified you as his own, guaranteeing that you will be saved on the day of redemption. And then when you go on down, he's going to tell you about a lot of things to shed off and get rid of. Anger, bitterness, and all of this. So when you read about losing your life, you're talking about that old life that we used to live before we came to know Christ. And you can look at it too when it comes to the meat of the thing. Look at all the apostles, how the apostles died. Boiling oil, salt into everything like that. And they lost their life for the new life.
Yeah.
Christ offers us to give them.
Yeah.
It's almost too like stepping out of self.
Mm.
You releasing
Mm-hmm.
and let him see your vulnerability. That way you're giving your all to him. It's not about you doing it for face.
Yeah. That's hard. I've heard a few times, we're not called to be successful, we're called to be faithful. And there's a part of me that hates that phrase. I think I heard it maybe originally with some preachers talking about church growth strategies. And like, of course you want your ministry to be successful, right? Of course you want more people to hear the word. Of course you want, but what we're called to is not the success, right? Like, it's God that gives growth. All we can be called to is faithfulness. And maybe this will be when God blesses us with a certain type of growth, and maybe it's not his current, thing is what we thought growth would be, but it's not success, because it becomes that sort of ends justify the means. If what we think we're called to is the success, anything that gets us there could potentially be justified. But if what we're called to is faithfulness, then the success is up to God. We're just called to keep walking in faithfulness.
It's woven throughout his creation, because think of a seed or a plant.
Mm-hmm.
It has to die first
Yeah.
to become everything it's meant to be. It's like he meant that for us too. We have
Yeah.
to die to our own egos and ourselves before we can become who we're meant to be too.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's like the quote you had a little while back. It
Yeah.
might not come the way you think
Right.
it's gonna come.
Yeah.
We have our views of, a lot of people in the building, that's success.
But I love the way I think it ought to go.
So
Yeah.
God might not think you ready yet to
Yeah.
have that much responsibility. So it's still, like he said, if it don't come like you think, just be patient and know God is in control.
Yeah. Richard Beck has a book called Slavery to Death, I think it's called, which strikes me as one of his more academic books, or at least I have found it a bit of a slog to get through all of it. But the concepts I find fascinating. He's a psychologist, and so he does a lot of stuff with like the psychology of the fear of death, which if you listen to the way he talks about the psychology of it, there's certain things we can do that are like obviously motivated by a fear of death, right? If somebody feels threatened and they kill the person that they feel is threatening them, right? It's like preserving their own life, right? But the argument he makes is that almost all of our neurotices are in one way or another a version of a fear of death. Why do I want to become rich? Because money helps me avoid things that could kill me, right? Money buys me food, money buys me health care, right? Why do I want, success, status, career? Why is our culture obsessed with looking young, right? It's not because we think we're literally going to die tomorrow, but there are all ways of avoiding the fact that we're going to die, right? Money, power, youth, beauty, whatever, all of those things are, even though they're not the immediate, like I need to save my own life, they are a version of resisting the idea of death itself. And so then if it's that fear of death that causes a lot of neurotic behavior, right? We fight others because we're afraid of death. We're greedy because we think we need to accumulate. Then that fear of death actually leads to a lot of sinful behavior because, right, in an attempt to preserve our own life, we're selfish, we're greedy, we're, fiercely independent, we're, whatever. And so I think I've got a couple quotes or more verses on that. Here's a couple that Richard Beck uses in that slavery of death or fear of death material. 1 Corinthians 15, which I love that whole chapter, mostly about the resurrection, but these few verses, 54 to 57 in particular, says, "When the perishable has been clothed with the imperishable, and the mortal with immortality, then the saying that is written will come true, death has been swallowed up in victory. Where, O death, is your victory? Where, O death, is your sting? The sting of death is sin, and the power of sin is the law. But thanks be to God, He gives us victory through our Lord Jesus Christ." So, there's a couple things that stand out to me, and that verse is really interesting. Some scholars call this one of Paul's apocalyptic passages, which in that sense, apocalyptic just means like sort of the big story of cosmic conflict. Like, what is God doing in the heavens? What is the big story of what God is accomplishing? And in that sense, it's interesting to me that one of the main enemies he puts out there is death. Like, what is it that God is defeating? It's death. Death is the enemy. God is going to swallow up death in victory. But the other thing that's interesting to me is this little verse, the sting of death is sin. And I think it's interesting because to me it's almost the opposite of how I normally think of it, right? Like if you think of a scorpion or a snake, what is the sting? The sting is like the negative outcome. The scorpion causes the pain. Like what is the effect of the scorpion, right? It's the sting. And we often think about how sin leads to death, which is true, and that's biblical. But here Paul almost seems to be saying the opposite, where the sting of death is sin. And so I think maybe there's a kind of cyclical relationship. They both lead to each other, right? Original sin caused death. That's the Genesis 3 story. But in some sense, it's death that needs to be defeated. It's death that needs to be swallowed up because what death is doing is producing more sin, right? The sting of death is sin. I think I saw at least one hand.
Sin don't hurt. I mean, death don't hurt if there's no sin. That's the whole point of, this is the gospel. If you start in verse 1, that's the gospel going down through. That when you take sin out of the way, death don't hurt because what's going to happen when we die? We're going to be better off.
Yeah.
Like Paul said, it's better that he go on and be with the Lord. But for the sake of the ministry of the Lord here, he would stay. But yeah, it's when the sin is removed, that don't hurt. And that's the whole point of the victory in the gospel message.
Yeah.
It makes sense.
And the blood of Christ is the remedy for the sting of death. We will not be stung by death because Christ broke the sting out of death.
Yeah.
So just like a queen bee with a yellow head do not have a stinger. But the one that's got that black head, if it don't have a yellow head on it, don't mess with that one.
I feel like I'm in the animal class next door. I'm learning some stuff here.
But that's what occurred. Christ, us partaking the Lord's Supper, drinking His blood every Sunday.
Yeah.
Jason's the best personification of that, of death, where is your sting? Some of us have been around Bama long enough to remember Howard and Gloria Maley, and Gloria was literally on her deathbed, and she woke from a nap and she was expressing some frustration, and Howard said, "What's wrong, sweetheart?" And she said, "Well, I was taking a nap and I woke up and I'm still here." she was ready. There was no sting in death. She was ready. If anybody was ready, Gloria was ready.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. And then the next verse I had up here was Hebrews 2:14 through 15. "Since the children have flesh and blood, he too shared in their humanity, so that by his death he might break the power of him who holds the power of death, that is, the devil, and free those who all their lives were held in slavery by their fear of death." And so I think very similar, but it's interesting here that it explicitly talks about Satan wielding the power of death. What is Satan's power over us? It's that he can hold death over us. And that's where I think Richard Beck gets the title of his book, Slavery to Their Fear of Death. So that's a powerful image to me, that how is it that Satan is holding power over us in this world? He can enslave us to our fear of death. And so then I think I've got a quote from an early church father, John Chrysostom, whose last name I'm sure I did not pronounce correctly, from the 300s AD. So I love the early church fathers because, we want to be a New Testament church. We want to believe the things the first church believed, and people from the 200s and 300s are so much closer to that culture that often the way they thought about it is at least interesting and informative in some way to hear, how did they talk about it pretty early on. And so this is sorry for the long quote, but a passage from John Chrysostom. He who fears death is a slave and subjects himself to everything in order to avoid dying. But he who does not fear death is outside the tyranny of the devil. For indeed, man would give his skin for skin and all things for the sake of his life. And if a man should decide to disregard this, whose slave is he then? He fears no one. He is in terror of no one. He is higher than everyone, freer than everyone. For he who disregards his own life disregards more so all things. And when the devil finds such a soul, he can accomplish in it none of his works. Tell me, though, what can he threaten? The loss of money or honor, or exile from one's country? For these are small things to him who counteth not even his life dear, says blessed Paul. Do you see that in casting out the tyranny of death, he has dissolved the strength of the devil? All right, we got maybe 15 minutes left. I'm trying to remember what all slides I've got after this, if I'm going to tie it back to this idea of kind of accepting the world and letting go. But the reason I decided to include all this, because I think, again, some of the slavery to death stuff is hard, is, again, that quote where Jesus is talking about, you have to forsake everything to follow me. Like if you're unwilling to follow me because you won't give up your possessions, you're not worthy to me. If you're unwilling to follow me because your family doesn't want you to and you can't say no to them to say yes to me, you're not worthy of me. You have to forsake even life itself. And why would Christ say you have to forsake even life itself? And I think maybe there's a lot of reasons, but some of them seem to be in this kind of stuff, right? If what we're concerned about is preserving our own life, we're still under that tyranny of the fear of death. The devil still got that over us. But if we count our own life nothing for the sake of Christ, right? If we're willing to forsake our own life, you can't kill somebody who's already died, right? Or you can't threaten with death somebody who... What's that?
Who isn't afraid to die. I mean,
Right,
I
isn't
think
afraid of
that's
it.
There's so many things that the fear of death make you have to protect, right? You have to protect your possessions, so that makes you more selfish. You have to protect your everything. I mean, everything ends up being like the whole protection aspect, because if you don't, yada, 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 someone might die, I might not have the best life, I might not have this or that. And so anyone or anything coming at your life, you see as this is a threat to my existence, a threat to my life, and so you're constantly assessing whether you want to help someone, whether you want to give this or not, whether you want to risk your life for someone. You're just always assessing, is this worth my life? And when you don't have that, then you're a lot freer, like the passage says.
Yeah, that's good.
We tend to avoid the talk of death, though, if you think about it. Or even use metaphors like he passed, things like that. And we don't realize that you look at the persecuted church in other parts of the world. You know, we're not out there singing loudly, making sure sound is turned up. They're hiding in little places where they can slowly or lowly, whisper the songs they want to sing because of the threat that they face, and yet they're willing to go and face that threat, knowing if they got caught, meant instant death.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes we're not used to, we don't have that type of persecution. And so why talk about death?
Yeah. Yeah, we avoid it in every way we possibly can. I remember when my grandmother passed away, Garrett was about 4, and we took him to the funeral. It was up in the panhandle of Texas, and it was an open casket funeral. And I remember just thinking like, oh, should I let my 4-year-old go up and see the open? But it was, maybe 100 years ago when nobody died in hospitals, right? When you just died in the home. And since then, our society has shifted to where you can go your whole life without ever seeing death, right? And then we do cover it up with beauty and youthfulness and, perfection. And yeah, we don't want to talk about it. We don't want to acknowledge it. And, yeah. All right, let's push forward. I think I've got one more weird concept for y'all, which is the idea of an eccentric identity, which I thought about just not using that word because it's a weird word to us, but then I thought it was fun. And so we're going to try to think about what it means. So if you hear the word eccentric, we sometimes describe people as eccentric. What does that mean to you? What do you think of an eccentric person?
Quirky.
Quirky. Yeah.
Almost to the edge of crazy.
Yeah. Yeah. Tiptoeing the line of craziness.
It's on a different level.
What's that?
They're on a different level.
On a different level. Okay, good. So this is another one of the things that Richard Beck talks about, is having an eccentric identity. And I had no idea why he was using that word at first. But apparently the etymology, and it kind of makes sense if you just think about the word, centric, central, like circle, and X is out. And so it's someone who's off center, right? Someone who's outside the norm, the bounded circle, right? But if we think about it sort of biblically and in terms of our identity, I pulled the King James here because of one phrase, and then we'll look at the NIV too. And I don't know that this necessarily gets to eccentric exactly, but I thought it was at least interesting. So 1 Peter 2:9, but ye are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a peculiar people, that ye should shew forth the praises of him who hath called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. So the phrase that I thought was interesting, we are a peculiar people, which the NIV then translates as God's special possession, which is probably the one we're a little bit more used to, which I think gets to the concept of holiness, right? If you've studied holiness in the Old Testament, what the word holy means is basically just set apart. So it's something different. It's not common because it's been set apart.
You're not weird.
Yeah.
You're special.
Yeah. And so I don't know for sure if the King James meant peculiar in the way we mean it in a modern sense. Is it saying we're weird, we're special? But I do think there's a sense in being God's special possession that we are different from the world, right? And so if we think of eccentric in terms of the circle of what the world considers normal, what's central in this world now, we are called to be different from that. And so that's sort of the idea of eccentric, but the way Richard Beck uses it is a little twist on that. He means it in terms of outside of yourself. So where do I get my identity? Well, I'm smart. I'm successful, right? I have a certain family. I have a certain career. Those are things that I use to try to define me. And those can all be taken away from me. But what if our core identity isn't from within ourselves, but is what is given to us by God, right? If we find our identity in God himself, that is something outside of ourselves, so that is eccentric to us. So when Richard Beck talks about having eccentric identity, he means something that is from outside the circle of our own personality, so to speak, our own self in this life as it currently is, but instead grounded in God, which is outside of us. So here's one way he describes it. He talks about how Jesus is the perfect example of an eccentric identity. He says, Jesus receives his identity from the Father. Jesus' identity isn't a possession or an accomplishment that has to be protected or defended in the face of loss or threat. Jesus' identity is received as a gift, an ongoing gift. And because Jesus does not possess his identity, Jesus can never be dispossessed of his identity. This is what makes Jesus non-anxious, non-rivalrous, and non-violent. that his identity is located in a place where death has no dominion. And so if you think, well, is that biblical? Where does Jesus get his identity? Obviously, one of the stories we would probably pretty quickly go to is the baptism story. And so in Luke 3, 21, 22 is when John the Baptist immerses Jesus. And verses 21 and 22 say, when all the people were being baptized, Jesus was baptized too. And as he was praying, heaven was opened, and the Holy Spirit descended on him in bodily form like a dove. And a voice came from heaven, "You are my Son, whom I love. With you I am well pleased." And so I think this is where we could sort of center the idea of Christ being given his identity by the Father. It's not something he earns through actions in his life. It's not something he has to protect because people can, shame him out of his identity. It's something that the Father has just given him. Who are you? You're my Son. Right? That's what defines you, right? That's where your identity is grounded. You're mine. And so I think the challenge for us then would be to also center our identity similarly. I'm always cautious of taking a Bible verse that wasn't written directly to us and making it about us. What's the Jeremiah 29 one? I've got plans for you. That's like a nerdy pet peeve of mine that we ignore the context. But I think here it's okay that we are also God's children, right? I mean, we're told that in other verses. And so this is what he specifically says to Jesus. But I think it's okay for us to hear, "You're my child," from God, right? For us to hear, "You are beloved." For us to hear that God say, "I delight in you." And that's who we are.
That concept saves lives.
Yeah.
That changes people's whole outlook on life when you really do it. I mean, it changed my life. At a time, it was like my belief system of who I was had everything to do with my relationships, my family, how much money I had, and so I had all these glass ceilings because someone told me at some point in childhood that I wasn't smart or I wasn't pretty or I wasn't funny, and so I had all these glass ceilings. But when I shifted the idea that those things are not who I actually am and started to challenge those beliefs and went into the beliefs of I'm God's child and he cares about me and I can, he has all these promises for me. Stop listening to these things and start putting all my faith in these things, then my whole life was different then. Your whole outlook on life is different then.
Yeah.
You die to your ego of what it was before and become something new.
Yeah. That's good.
That's what
Thanks for
makes
sharing.
us peculiar.
What's that?
That's
Weird.
what makes us peculiar.
Weird.
Yeah.
It's what we believe, because at a time that everybody believed the way to obtain land or all of that you had to conquer it, and you had to be mighty, and then you got some people believing the meek will inherit the earth. It'll just be given to them by lot. That was weird, eccentric, whatever words you want to put, because they know that's not how the earth is gathered. It's conquered, and the booty or everything that's left go to the people who conquered it. They understood that. And then here's some people saying, "Oh no, the meek will inherit it." That's crazy. But what we believe is what makes us peculiar, just like then. Like you say, you find out what it meant to who it was written to, then we learn from it because it was preserved for us.
Yeah.
And carry it further, I think, comparing, as I've been thinking this past course that you've been doing of contemplative faith and comparing it to the Beatitudes, and the whole Beatitudes kind of fall into that whole niche of contemplative faith, but you think about eccentric, blessed are the poor in spirit.
Yeah.
That's a little out of the central, but blessed those who mourn. That's way out of the bounds. So I think there's a lot of tied up in Jesus' instructions to how to disciple, which I think are the Beatitudes. it very much describes everything that we're talking about here in this class.
Yeah,
Jason,
thanks.
to wax philosophical, emphasis on the wax. Can Satan be considered the personification of our fear of death?
I think there's certainly a tie there. Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting thing to ponder, but I think those verses we looked at before draw a really close connection between the power of Satan and the fear of death, right? I mean, they're certainly related.
Jason, I think about Paul. I think he was very eccentric because he said, I can be all things to all people.
Yeah.
I can get on each level, whether they're Roman or Jew, Greek, Hebrew, whatever. And I think it's all formed around the personalities.
Yeah. Yeah. All right, I'm going to have to let y'all go in just a second. It's always dangerous to start a thought when you're not sure where it's going, but somebody said something about it. Julie, it was probably when you were talking about not caring what others think, right? Even as I think about our own history within sort of like churches of Christ and the Restoration movement, there's a lot of good and bad, right? There's beauty and there's warts. There's things I love and things I'm glad we've moved beyond or whatever. But some of the things that I value the most, right? Some of our traditions of pursuing the things of the kingdom of God rather than power in this world, and some of the theologies I like the best, I feel like we were maybe most capable of embracing when we were this kind of obscure, poor, rural movement that we didn't have any worldly power and we didn't really care that much what people thought of us. And the more that we start to care what people think of us, the more things tend to go awry. I mean, when people seek respectability, in some ways that can be a temptation, the approval of man, whether it's, just approval or actual power or, a seat at the table of certain things, respectability. I think that can tempt us into things that are less than faithfulness to God. And if we can ground ourselves just in our identity in God and not in the approval of man, there's freedom there.
It brings us back to your first slide.
Yeah. Good.
Don't do things to be seen of men.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, I need to let y'all go. Thanks for being here. I think we got one more class in this series, right? Next week maybe is the last one, so I'll see you then.